In this tutorial, we're going to start dealing with splines, but before I jump into that, you'll notice that I have a scene that's set up here with what is a reference plane inside it. If I click on my view cube and orbit around, you'll see there's a polygon out here. It has reference on it. I can't click on it. In my front view, it's perfectly lined up here so that it's centered with the base at 0. All right? And so for a number of my tutorials, I'm going to provide you with reference like this. So how do you get a max scene like this with an image and get it in place? Well, I'm going to come over here and go to, let's close some of these tabs I got. So here I am, I'm on this specific assignment, and you'll see that there's a tutorial, there's an example of what I want you to turn in, and then over here there's a spline lathe.zip. I'm going to hold control on my keyboard. On my keyboard, it's the bottom leftmost button. It says CTRL. I'm going to click on Spline Lathe. That pops open a new tab. I'm going to go to that tab. And what I want to do here is I want to find this button, the one that says Download. I'm going to click on Download. So that starts a download. The file downloads. In this case, it's going to go relatively quick. I'm going to click on the Show All button, and that's going to show me all the downloads I have. You may have more. What I've done here is specifically gone in and cleared all mine out so that you can just focus here on the Spline Lathe. So I'm going to click Show in Folder, and that pops open another folder, which is my downloads. And there you see Spline Lathe is sitting right inside there. Now this is a zip file. What we need to do is get the information out of it. So what I'm going to do is next I'm going to navigate to the location on my computer where I'm keeping all of my work files. So if I right click down here and go to Documents, inside of my Documents, I have my 3ds Max 2021 folder. I'm going to go in there. I'm going to go into Scenes. And now inside this folder, I have a subfolder where I've gone through and organized my work. If I back out, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drag that spline lathe into that location. And now I'm going to right click on it and say Extract All. And I'm just going to go with the defaults here and say Extract. Now that pops open a window showing you where it is. If I close that, you can see that now there's that spline lathe folder. So I can take this .zip file and delete it. I don't need that anymore. And now when I go into Spline Lathe, there's an extra folder in there. You could reorganize that by dragging that up if you want, and then just deleting the one so it's more up at the root and it's less nested. But there you go. Now you'll see inside there I have two files, Spline Lathe and Ref Lathe. And so basically, as long as you keep the reference in the same folder as the max file, every time you open up the max file, it will find that. What I can do from here is I can click in this path window, right click and copy that, and then say File, Open, and paste that path in here, and then it navigates, Max will navigate me directly to that location. I can say Open, and now it finds that scene with that reference directly inside of it. So I will save this chunk off as a separate tutorial so that you have that in for access for the future, because that'll work for any of the many tutorials I have that utilize zip files. So from there though, I'm going to jump right into working with splines. And how do we make this head out of a spline? So here's my reference. I'm going to go ahead and go to Create here. Now, one of the first things that you need to know is when you start working with splines, you have to work in an orthographic view, specifically one of the named views, front, top, left, or right if you happen to have that viewport set up. Splines are drawn directly on the surface of whichever viewport it is, and so here out in perspective it would be drawn down here on the ground. Another thing that's good to know about splines is you want to try working in the positive axis. All right, and so let's talk a little bit about that. I'm going to click here and say Maximize Viewport. Down in the bottom right hand corner you have X, Y, and Z coordinates showing up. X is over here to the right, Z is going up, Y is going towards us. So here in a front view, the right side of this dark black line, this would be positive X, this is negative X. We want to try to do all of our work over here in the positive space. There's many reasons why. A lot of the defaults will go from positive over to negative, so it's a good habit to be working on this right-hand side. So here I am now, I'm in Create. And so by default, we're in geometry, and that's how we make large objects. I'm going to click on the next button over, which is Shapes. Shapes are these two-dimensional objects. If you've ever worked in Illustrator, you may have seen them before. So I turned on line, I clicked, and that makes a line. I click and I drag, that makes another line. I click. Every time I click, it makes a point. Anytime I click and drag, it makes a curve. If I click on the beginning of my line, I get an option to close the spline. I'm going to say yes. Now I went over to modify, and you can see now inside of modify, I have access to the different components. So line is different from a polygon in that it's made up of vertex points, segments, which is the point in between 2 points, and then a spline, which is the entire contiguous shape. So if I go back to vertex, when I right click, you'll see that I get more menu items. Right? There's the standard transform, there's the standard display, tools 2, and tools 1. You'll notice up here in tools 1 that beyond being able to switch between the different components of top level, vertex, segment, and spline, I also have the ability here to reset the tangents, right? Or to change what that point is. So if I come up here and say this point right here, I'm going to go right click and go into move, I can grab that handle and move it around. If I want to move the handles independently, I can right click and change this to a Bezier corner so that now I can move those independently. And say I just want to move this one in a little bit, I could right click on it and turn that into a Bezier, and now those handles will be locked together. I could also, if I don't want to deal with the handles, I could say smooth, and smooth kind of tries to smooth out between the points, right? It's a lot less control. Or I could just right click and say corner. So if you accidentally make a Bezier, don't worry about it. You could always go through, right click, and just convert them all over to corners. The most important thing to know about working with splines is you shouldn't worry about making the perfect shape with a spline, because you can always come in here to line, or if you right click on an object and convert it to an editable spline, you still have the ability to go in and manipulate the original shape, as well as under the geometry rollout, go through and click on refine to add additional points, smooth them out if you want, turn them into Beziers, and adjust them. There's lots of other controls and tools inside here which we'll get into in future tutorials. So let's go ahead and let's just delete this line. And let's start talking on something a little bit more specific to what we're doing. So here we have this simple Lego head. And what I'm going to do is I want to go in here and I'm going to create this as an object. Now, we're going to use a specific tool called a lathe. And to do that, we need a spline. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to click somewhere near the top of the head. I'm just going to click. And what I'm doing is I'm going and I'm hitting the main points of this head. I right click to get out of create mode with the line. And now I'm going to go over to modify. So right now it is a little bit tricky to see because you see that the lines in my reference are white and the spline itself is white. So why don't I go in here into the material editor and say material, get all C materials, and if I click on the material itself, I can change the diffuse color to black. Now you see it has a little M next to it. So that means there's a map associated with it, the diffuse color. The map is my reference, and I can change the opacity on that to, say, 25%, right? The amount that the image shows up. So now I can close this. And so now you see my reference is a little bit darker, right? And so knowing you could go in and change things like that is going to help you as needed. The reference image I gave you is very low res. It's very blurry. And that's okay. I don't want you to be worried about making this head absolutely perfect. All right, so now we're in here. We're in modify, we're in the line. I've expanded here to show you the different components that make it up. Let me drag this up. When you're working in edit spline here, it's really useful to make sure you grab the edge and drag it over, because geometry is one of those rollouts that's just really, really long and keeps going on. So it's good to have an expanded tab here. All right, so first off, it'll be good for us if this center line, this first line, is actually sitting at 0. So I'm going to come down here to X and enter a 0 value. Now, I got this point here, right? And it looks like it does kind of have a little bit of shape. So what I'm going to do is come down to Chamfer. I'm going to click on the spinner and drag, and you can see that separates the point by whatever our numeric amount is. So I'm going to go about here. Take this point, make that a little bit straighter. And then over here, where these guys are, why don't we try another one? What I'm going to do is grab both of these points, and I'm going to set my weld threshold to 500 and hit weld. And what I'm going to do is kind of move them up to line them up kind of with the center of this here. I'm going to use a different tool on this. I'm going to take this guy, and I'm actually going to use fillet. So if I click and drag on the spinner, you see how it separates them, but instead of being a straight line like chamfer, this one actually rolls. It creates a curve in between it. So I'm going to do the same thing down here. We'll just grab these 2 points and weld them together. And now I'm going to move this over and kind of try and make it straight. I'm not going to worry about everything being perfectly straight here. There we go. So now we're going to take this point and we're going to do the same thing with flag. We're going to click and drag to drag that up. There we go. So if these points are right on top of each other, then you could go ahead and weld them together. These are slightly separated. Let's see if I move this over a little bit. I kind of want it to be a little bit straight there, with a little bit of separation, so I'm going to leave it. All right, so now I have this basic kind of Lego head. Let's straighten this guy out a little bit more. Okay, so this is kind of what I'm looking for. It's got a little hard edge here, and it's curved around the rest of the sides. Let's turn this into geometry. From here, I'm going to click on the little plus sign and go to Restore Viewport. So here's my spline shape. It's sitting out here in the world. It's flush with the y-axis, right? And everything's sitting over here in positive x. Let's click on our modifier list and find a modifier called Lathe. L-A-T-H-E, Lathe. And there we go. Well, we're off to a good start because here, now it's making geometry. It's taking our spline and it's spinning it around 360 degrees, which you can see right here, and it's creating a shape. Now, right away, that's not what we want, and so we can check our alignment by saying min, which, look at that, it did it, right? There's also center and max. So you can kind of see right here, center centers it on the spline. Max takes the outermost edge, and then min goes to the inside. Now, at this point, everything is very dark, which means our object is inside out. All right? I could check this because I left an opening on the bottom, right? And so you orbit around, you could see. So let's go ahead, and this is where under parameters there's an option to flip normals. We want to do that because when you click flip normals, it now says everything is facing the other direction. To check that, you could go to display, and you could go to display properties and turn on back face cull. So now, if you look down here underneath, nothing's there. Another thing to look at is here on the top of the head, you see how we have this kind of nasty look. So let's turn on our edged faces. You can see there's our geometry. What's happening is all these points are coming together. There's another option here we're going to want to turn on under parameters called weld to core. If we click on that, now those points are welded together and it's much cleaner. So what we can do at this point is we could kind of say, do we want to have 16 settings or do we want to crank it up to 32 to make it rounder? We'll just leave it at 16 for the purposes of what we're doing. Some additional things to know, depending on when you make your spline and the shape you're making, in addition to adjusting the alignment, you may need to change the direction to X, Y, or Z, right? And it's really going to depend on the type of object that you're making, right? In our case, Y was the one we wanted. And now I got to get it back to where it was originally. There we go. Orbit that around. You do have output options. We're going to leave ours on mesh all the time. The last thing I would recommend is that you turn on generate mapping coordinates, because that'll at least create some kind of basic UV coordinates for the object. Well, there you go. That's an introduction to splines and lathe specifically. This actually turns it into a really nice model. What you could do now is just take a screenshot of that and turn that in along with the max file.